Politics of Indonesia.
Politics is the set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relations among individuals, such as the distribution of resources or status. The branch of social science that studies politics and government is referred to as political science. The politics of Indonesia take place in the framework of a presidential representative democratic republic whereby the president of Indonesia is both head of state and head of government and of a multi-party system. Executive power is exercised by the government. Legislative power is vested in both the government and the bicameral People's Consultative Assembly. The judiciary is independent of the executive and the legislature. The 1945 Constitution provided for a limited separation of executive, legislative, and judicial power. The governmental system has been described as presidential with parliamentary characteristics. Following the Indonesian riots of May 1998 and the resignation of President Suharto, several political reforms were set in motion via amendments to the Constitution of Indonesia, which resulted in change. To all branches of government. The Economist Intelligence Unit rated Indonesia a flawed democracy in 2022. Indonesia's political parties have been characterized as cartel parties with extensive power sharing among parties and limited accountability to voters. Currently, scholars are conflicted about the strength and durability of Indonesia's democracy. Indonesia scores well on certain characteristics of democracy, such as political rights, classifying it as a democracy in the minimalist interpretation of the word. However, the country lacks other aspects of democracy that are usually required for a regime to reach democratic consolidation, such as adequate civil rights protections. A minimalist view of democracy classifies political regimes purely in terms of their institutions and procedures rather than the outcomes they produce. Specifically, a regime must implement free and fair elections. In Indonesia, the president is directly elected and can serve up to 2 5-year terms. There are limited voting irregularities, and international election monitors consider the elections free and fair. Additionally, in 2019, the Constitutional Court rejected claims of widespread voter fraud. The right to organize competing political parties is respected, and the system allows for the competition of several political parties. Thus, according to the minimalist definition, Indonesia is a democracy. However, a maximalist approach to democracy claims that free and fair elections are insufficient to consider a regime a democracy. Maximalists argue that these countries must also guarantee other social, political, and economic rights, often those found in consolidated democracies. These include human rights protections, civil rights, egalitarianism, judicial independence, and more. Individuals in Indonesia are generally not free to practice and express their religious faith. Atheists and those who practice one of the unrecognized faiths in Indonesia can be penalized and face discrimination. Additionally, the court system often has many instances of corruption, and there is no due process in civil and criminal matters. Thus, Indonesia fails to meet many of the civil requirements for a consolidated or maximalist democracy. The durability of democracies can be attributed to a few key characteristics, such as per capita income, the control of political parties, and the frequency of elections. Indonesia scores very well in each of these categories. Indonesia has a relatively high per capita income of $5,000 USD, has multiple competing political parties, and has new leadership elected every 5 years. So, although Indonesia may not yet be a consolidated democracy, the country has made tremendous progress in advancing its score in democratic processes and durability. The old order 1950-1965 in Indonesia has long been understood to be a period of turmoil and crisis, characterized by rebellions and political unrest. The weakness of Indonesia's democracy and its gradual transition to authoritarianism during the old order can be attributed to conventional modernization theory, which suggests that without strong socio-economic structures, successful transitions to democracy are unlikely. Indeed, it was not until the late 1960s when urbanization took place that the Indonesian government began to build a stronger democracy. During the liberal democracy period 1950-1957, Indonesia aspired to renew its global status and achieve modernity as a newly independent country. In line with this vision, it sought to establish a democratic parliamentary system, bringing forth a multi-party system, cabinet government under a prime minister, and a ceremonial president. However, the economic instability inherited from colonial rule significantly hindered their democratic nation-building vision. The Indonesian economy struggled to recover from the hardships of colonial occupation, with economic growth being stagnant and inflation reaching over 600% between the 1950s-1960s. Indonesia's economy heavily relied on the agricultural sector, but without diversification and industrialization, the government became vulnerable to polarization and instability. Moreover, Indonesia's abundance of natural resources, such as coffee, rubber, and cocoa, made it susceptible to the political resource curse. Indonesia's resource wealth led to corruption, inequality, and political instability, hindering economic and social progress. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few elites with a monopoly over these resources worsened the country's economic and political problems. This ultimately led to rising political tensions and the government's loss of control. Guided democracy, which was in place from 1957 to 1966, aimed to bring about political stability, modernization, and development under the leadership of President Sukarno. Initially, Sukarno sought to build political institutions to bolster representation and resolve conflicts of regionalism, social class, and religion that plagued the parliament during the liberal democracy era. However, power became increasingly centralized to the executive branch in the latter half of guided democracy, with Sukarno assuming a dictator-like role in the government. Indonesia's gradual transition to authoritarianism during the guided democracy period exemplifies the failure of the democratic project in the country due to weak socio-economic structures and the political resource curse that undermined its democratic development. Transition to the new order. The transition to the new order in the mid-1960s ousted Sukarno after 22 years in the position. One of the most tumultuous periods in the country's modern history, it was the commencement of Suharto's three-decade presidency. Described as the Great Delang puppet master, Sukarno drew power from balancing the opposing and increasingly antagonistic forces of the army and the Communist Party of Indonesia opening parenthesis PK closing parenthesis BY 1965. The key extensively penetrated all levels of government and gained influence at the expense of the army. On September 30, 1965, 6 of the military's most senior officers were killed in an action generally labeled an attempted coup by the so-called 30 September movement, a group from within the armed forces. Within a few hours, Major General Suharto mobilized forces under his command and took control of Jakarta. Anti-communists, initially following the army's lead, went on a violent purge of communists throughout the country, killing an estimated 500,000 people and destroying the key, which was officially blamed for the crisis. The politically weakened Sukarno was forced to transfer key political and military powers to General Suharto, who had become head of the armed forces. In March 1967, the Provisional People's Consultative Assembly (MPRCs) named General Suharto acting president. He was formally appointed President 1 year later. Sukarno lived under virtual house arrest until his death in 1970. In contrast to the stormy nationalism, revolutionary rhetoric, and economic failure that characterized the early 1960s under the left-leaning Sukarno, Suharto's pro-Western New Order stabilized the economy but continued. The official state philosophy of Pancasila. Sukarno, Indonesia's first national figure and president, dissolved the elected assembly, introduced a concept known as guided democracy, and reinstated the 1945 Constitution in 1959. The period of guided democracy was marked by the creation of a plethora of ministries, by the rise of the Indonesia Communist Party Partai Komunis Indonesia, key to a position of political dominance, and by the emergence of the army as a major anti-communist political force. The structure collapsed with an attempted coup d'etat in 1965, which led to the downfall of Sukarno. Under Suharto, Sukarno's successor, Indonesia entered a new political era, officially called the New Order. The New Order Indonesian, Orde Baru, is the term coined by President Suharto to characterize his regime as he came to power in 1966. He used this term to contrast his rule with that of his predecessor, Sukarno, dubbed the Old Order, or Orde Lama. The term New Order in more recent times has become synonymous with the Suharto years 1966–1998. Immediately following the attempted coup in 1965, the political situation was uncertain, but the New Order found much popular support from groups wanting a separation from Indonesia's problems since its independence. The generation of 66 Angkatan 66 epitomized talk of a new group of young leaders and new intellectual thought. Following communal and political conflicts and economic collapse and social breakdown of the late 1950s through to the mid-1960s, the New Order was committed to achieving and maintaining political order, economic development, and the removal of mass participation in the political process. The features of the New Order established from the late 1960s were thus a strong political role for the military, the bureaucratization and corporatization of political and societal organizations, and selective but effective repression of opponents. Strident anti-communism remained a hallmark of the regime for its subsequent 32 years. Within a few years, however, many of its original allies had become indifferent or averse to the New Order, which comprised a military faction supported by a narrow civilian group. Among much of the pro-democracy movement which forced Suharto to resign in 1998 and then gain power, the term New Order has come to be used pejoratively. It is frequently employed to describe figures who were either tied to the New Order or who upheld the practices of his authoritarian regime, such as corruption, collusion, and nepotism, widely known by the acronym KN, Korupsi, Kolusi, Nepotism. Reform era. The post-Suharto era began with the fall of Suharto in 1998, during which Indonesia has been in a period of transition, an era known as Reformasi reform. This period has seen a more open and liberal political social environment. The post-Suharto era began with the fall of Suharto in 1998, during which Indonesia has been in a period of transition, an era known as Reformasi reform. This period has seen a more open and liberal political social environment. Indonesia's transition to democracy was a key part of the broader reform era. Democratic transitions tend to be grouped into two categories: bottom-up transitions where people rise up and overthrow an existing regime, and top-down transitions where an authoritarian ruler introduces liberalizing reforms leading to democratic transition. Indonesia experienced a transition toward democratic rule that involved both bottom-up and top-down forces after the fall of the authoritarian regime in 1998, thus altering the political structure of the country. Differences in democratization across developing countries, including Indonesia, is common and may be explained by different theoretical models. While Indonesia has been considered a democracy since the fall of the authoritarian regime in 1998, democratic consolidation has not completely been achieved. Among these were term limits of up to 2 5-year terms for the president and vice president and measures to institute checks and balances. The highest state institution is the People's Consultative Assembly Indonesian, Majelis Permusyawaratan Rakyat (MPR), whose functions previously included electing the president and vice president. Since 2004, the president has been elected directly by the people, establishing broad guidelines of state policy and amending the constitution. The 695-member MPR includes all 550 members of the People's Representative Council Indonesian Dewan Perwakilan Rakyat (DPR) plus 130 members of Regional Representative Council Indonesian Dewan Perwakilan Daerah (DPD) elected by the 26 provincial parliaments and 65 appointed members from societal groups. The DPR, which is the premier legislative institution, originally included 462 members elected through a mixed proportional or district representational system and 38 appointed members of the Indonesian Armed Forces (TNI) and Police Polri. NI or Polri representation in the DPR and MPR ended in 2004. Societal group representation in the MPR was eliminated in 2004 through further constitutional change. Having served as rubber stamp bodies in the past, the DPR and MPR have gained considerable power and are increasingly assertive in oversight of the executive branch. Under constitutional changes in 2004, the MPR became a bicameral legislature, with the creation of the DPD, in which each province is represented by 4 members, although its legislative powers are more limited than those of the DPR. Through his or her appointed cabinet, the president retains the authority to conduct the administration of the government. A general election in June 1999 produced the first freely elected national, provincial, and regional parliaments in over 40 years. In October 1999, the MPR elected a compromise candidate, Abdurrahman Wahid, as the country's 4th president, and Megawati Sukarno Putri, a daughter of Sukarno, as the vice president. Megawati's DDP party had won the largest share of the vote, 34, in the general election, while Golkar, the dominant party during the New Order, came in second, 22. Several other, mostly Islamic parties won shares large enough to be seated in the DPR. Other nationwide democratic elections took place in 2004, 2009, 2014, and 2019. In Indonesia, while free and fair elections have been held and a constitution guaranteeing certain rights and freedoms exists, corruption and involvement of money in politics persists. Corruption in regional government is often revenue-related, involving bribery and theft of public goods for personal gain, and identifies political corruption, such as fraudulent behavior and deviant lobbying techniques, as the type committed by government officials. Additionally, one of the primary reasons Indonesia may not be considered a consolidated democracy is due to their lack of civilian control over the military. Indonesia has created democratic institutions, but there is still progress that must be made to address the challenges the country currently faces in order to consolidate democracy. Civil society in Indonesia. Civil society is a term that has been coined by both sides of the political spectrum for their respective interests. It is defined broadly by David Reef as the wide range of organizations operating outside the governmental and business sectors. It has taken on ambiguous connotations as Robert Putnam has associated it with the strengthening of democratic government, while Sherry Berman has demonstrated how civil associations helped to collapse Weimar Germany. As with any other country, Indonesian civil society spans an array of organizations including professional, religious, intermediary, and mass-based. Under Suharto, civil society organizations (CSOs) often fought for democracy and human rights. Under Suharto, civil society in Indonesia was massively contained. The mass murders of the left limited CSOs to advocacy relating to human rights and democracy. After his fall, civil society established itself in the reformed era. CSOs in Indonesia are reflective of the unique politics of the country. They exist on a spectrum of opinion on Islam's proper role in the government. For example, in 2017, the Indonesian government prohibited the Indonesian chapter of Hizb ut-Tahrir using the Law on Mass-Based Organizations (ORMAS). Some CSOs condemned the action as a violation of human rights, while others saw the move as a necessity in curbing extremist ideology. ORMAS represents new bureaucratic regulations and restrictions on CSOs. The passage of this law has been associated with the Indonesian government's continued crackdown on free speech and expression. Humanprogress.org provides a civil society participation index which measures whether major CSOs routinely consulted by policymakers. How large is the involvement of people in CSOs? Are women prevented from participating? Among a variety of other factors, Indonesia's Civil Society Index has fluctuated throughout the 20th century. During the period of liberal democracy before Sukarno, Indonesia reached a civil society participation score of 0.74. During the presidencies of Sukarno and Suharto, the score plunged to 0.12. As Indonesia entered its reform era, the score climbed to 0.95. However, in recent years, Indonesia's Civil Society Participation Index has declined to 0.82. Compared to its neighbors in Southeast Asia, Indonesia has been hailed as a champion for free expression in the region. Other tools to measure civil society are the CSO Sustainability Index Explorer by CSOC.org and the Civil Society Index provided by the United Nations Development Programme. Thank you for watching.